Well, Mr. Cox, why don't we just start out with why you're running for governor?
Well, I'm a businessman. I'm from the private sector. I've been involved in politics for some point. I'm also the father of 4 daughters. I was telling people I have a 12-year-old, and yes, I get mistaken for the grandfather all the time. And she tells people, no, that's not my grandpa, that's my daddy. But most of all, it goes back, Avo, to my mom, who was a teacher on the south side of Chicago. And growing up, she would take me to her school to help tutor the kids in her high school. And I was maybe 10, 11 years old, and I would be tutoring high school juniors and seniors. Emmett and I talked about this. Emmett's from the south side. And, my mom would sometimes come home at night, and she'd literally cry on the sofa because she had to deal with some principals, which was just some of the worst principals you can imagine. They were arbitrary. They played favorites. They were, not very good leaders. And it was because of political corruption, Avo. It's because they were cronies. They were friends of the alderman, and that's how they got their job. And see, I looked at that as just a horrendous theft of those children's chances to get ahead and to really be a part of the economy. My mom was just a singular force, really instilling in me the idea that I can change things, that one person can change the world, that we need to take responsibility for our surroundings. So, you mentioned I'm a businessman, but I've always been involved in trying to change our system. And now, in this time and place, we've got a movement around the world where people are rising up and they're saying that they need their own power to change things, that in particular, the funders, the people who fund campaigns, the people who provide money for political campaigns are really the ones in power, and maybe it's time that we put the people really back in power. So, I'm not running for governor to just make changes on the margins. I'd stay home with my 12-year-old if that were the case. I'm running for governor to transform not only the political system, but with it the quality of life in California. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity to do that in 2018.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Cox. And I know you had mentioned in previous speeches and discussions with others that your family moved to California when it really was the Golden State and the envy of the country.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on, specifically ways to get back to being the envy of the country in terms of education and per pupil spending and helping the middle class?
My mom got 2 master's degrees from Berkeley, by the way. And actually, my older brother was born right here in San Jose. She got divorced. She had to move back to Chicago. Had me. My real father took one look at me and left. I think the Golden State, my mom would talk about it all the time as this land of opportunity and also this wonderful state that offered a great education. She always used to talk about how college education was free and available to every student in California who wanted to could go to a college in California. And that just was wonderful. My mom, by the way, retired to Fresno. She came back here in 1980. What's happened in the last 30 years, though? And that's what we have to ask ourselves, because if you look at the statistics, we're still spending a lot of money on education, but our results aren't anywhere near what they ought to be for this state, for the Golden State. And I really believe it's the special interests that have captured Sacramento. The schools aren't run for the parents or the students. They're run for the union bosses. They're run for the administrators. The money, we keep raising taxes. I gotta tell you, in the last just couple of years, the revenue of the state's gone up $50 billion. But has it ended up in the classroom? I don't think so. It's not. It's going to pensions, and it's going to administration, and it's not going into the classroom. I think, first of all, We need economic growth. So I've got specific plans. Hopefully we'll talk about those, because we've got to stop competing for this static pie. I mean, if you take Silicon Valley out of the picture, the rest of the state has not grown in 10 years. It's not. And I don't know if you know this, but the agricultural community is bigger than Silicon Valley. We're the largest dairy state in the country. We're the largest cattle raising state in the country. Yet that segment of the economy hardly has grown, and a lot of businesses have left the state. A lot of it, again, circles back to the special interests who really just dominate the state legislature and the governorship. And if we're going to get reforms that we really need to get in education, but also in economic growth, it's growth as business, we've got to break that stranglehold, and that's one of the things that I'm committed to doing.
Well, why don't we piggyback on the economic development issue area, Mr. Cox, but I want a little twist to it, if you don't mind. Love to hear what your thoughts are on economic development, but also want to get your thoughts on what economists are saying about the best investments we can make in society is in the youngest children of our society in terms of the rate of return on investment and their overall outcomes as they get older. So love to hear your thoughts on just economic development broadly, and then what your thoughts are on what studies have said of investing in children early.
You know, first of all, the way to really move up, I mean, politicians talk about inequality, right? We hear about it all the time. The best way to move up is to have your own small business. I started my business when I was 24 years old. I mean, I had no assets. I had no ability to do it. I just had gotten a good education, and I started out, advising people. I'm a CPA, first and foremost, and so I started doing tax returns for people just in a small little office. And I think, the wonderful thing about that is that you then can manage your time to be able to spend some time with your children. I think that's a lot of what's missing. Frankly, one of the big issues in this state is the affordability of life. Somebody mentioned that there's parents who are working 2 and 3 jobs to be able to afford a house in the state. When you're working 2 or 3 jobs, you don't have much time to spend with your young baby in early childhood development. And I'm sorry, I believe certainly there's a place for educational systems to help in early childhood development, but my God, it really has to start with the parents. It really I don't care if you're a single mom. My mom was a single mom, and she came home from school. She had worked 1 job. She could afford to do that in Chicago at that time. And she came home and she worked with us. And so, you can do it if you're not working 2 or 3 jobs. So I think affordability is a major element of it. And that gets the parents to be able to make that own investment of time. But I certainly believe in an investment in early childhood. For my own, I have my 4 daughters. Every single one of them, I went to little classes with them. I was very involved in their, there's little daddy and me groups. I sought them out everywhere I could to really spend quality time and, teach them numbers and teach them letters. And, it's so important for the parents, to be involved in that. But there has to be a facility that sponsors that. And so I'm a very big believer in that. But the last thing I want is for that kind of a facility to be caught up into this whole web of, the political and the unions and the rigid, environment there. I'm a big believer in vouchers, I have to tell you. I'm a huge believer in vouchers. And why? Because of competition. I'm from the private sector. I wake up every day trying to beat the competition. That's what I do. That's what every business person does. Don't we want every teacher waking up every day and making sure that they do the best they can to beat the competition, to make sure that they can get those vouchers? And don't we want parents to have that choice? I can drive down the street, I can choose 10 different restaurants because I have a choice. And if I don't like one, I can go to another one. And those restaurants compete for me. But we don't have that in probably the most important aspect of our life as a society, and that's the education of our children. Why have we basically said we're going to have a monopoly? We're not going to have a choice. We know that monopolies don't do the best job, but yet we think somehow we're being told that we need a monopoly to do this. I don't get it. I really don't. And obviously, some element of it is power, because when you control the dollars, you control, life. I want the parents to have the control, and I can see vouchers being extended for early childhood education, and I think that could be done, very well. And again, it requires a growing economy. We've got to have businesses actually stay in California. We've got to have businesses grow in California. I was with a woman last night who was a counsel for Intel. You all know Intel? I mean, what company, besides Apple, I suppose, personifies Silicon Valley, but Intel, right? They're making huge investments in Arizona. They're growing their workforce in Arizona. Why? It's unaffordable for their employees here. The regulations, the taxes, the costs of doing business in this state have grown exponentially. They're doing what the smart thing is. That's going to come back to haunt us. We need to change that attitude.
Thank you for that, Mr. Cox. And the statement you made around budgets earlier and where we spend our money in terms of education and how much we're spending per pupil and so forth, we've heard time and again, public budgets are a statement of values. And I know we've touched a little bit about some of your values, but in terms of the next budget, if you're elected governor, or the first budget, I should say, if you're elected governor, what are some specific things you would look at the state budget in order to ensure that kids are put first and then the economy is growing to support families?
Let me make one thing clear. I'm a businessman. Spending is absolutely a statement about values, and my opponent, Ms. Easton, makes that point very, very clearly. We got to spend a lot more money. But you know what? A businessman has limited resources. So it's more important to make sure that spending is efficient and effective, because you only have so much of it. And that's the problem. You can't just look at a budget and say we got to keep raising it because we value spending more money. If you don't evaluate the efficiency of the spending and the effectiveness of the spending, I always use roads because it's an easy thing to understand. It's harder to measure effective spending in education. I grant you that. But there's ways to do it. There are ways to do it. California, for example, spends 4.5 times what Texas does to build a mile of road. Did you know that? 4.5 times. Texas apparently uses their money effectively and efficiently. If just raising budgets were the holy grail, we could build roads by giving 1 million people a spoon, right? That would be spending money. Just give them a spoon and they just build a road, right? But we obviously use bulldozers, or we use major equipment to do that, right? Because it's effective and because it's efficient to use our resources in that fashion. So what's the issue with the education system? The money has to be spent efficiently and effectively. It shouldn't be done in administrators. I'm sorry. We've got to spend the money in the classrooms. The pension systems have really certainly benefited the existing teachers, and especially the ones with the seniority who are, wonderfully able to retire, oftentimes at 55, 60 years old, on pensions that are just wonderful for the rest of their lives. But I'm 62 years old. I'm not ready to retire. Do I look like I'm ready to retire? I think, frankly, these systems, again, are kind of built for, the politicians and the union bosses, and they're not built for the most effective and efficient use of our spending. We talk about a teacher shortage in this state. Have you heard this? We have a teacher shortage, and despite these pensions. And I think it's because our young people want to get involved in a system that rewards merit, that rewards effectiveness, that rewards results. I went into business because, not just to make a lot of money, but because that's a measure of how well I've done. That's a measure of my effectiveness. I mean, I always tell audiences, I want teachers paid like rock stars and baseball players. Not $10 million a year, but based upon their effectiveness and their ability to achieve. Isn't that what our system should be built on? Now, teaching is looked upon by our young people, I think, as a kind of a unionized lockstep job. If there's a layoff at a school, who gets cut? The last in, right? The least senior. The people with seniority get the advantage. Well, I think we need to run our schools for the quality and for the effectiveness of the school, not because it's a union environment for that purpose. It's got to be a professional environment.
So let me expand on that last point you just made regarding quality and teacher pay. In the early childhood field before kindergarten, teachers are made half or less than half of what a K-12 teacher makes in California. And to your point, it's not a great incentive to have young people or anyone else get into teaching the youngest of our residents in California. What would you do to sort of level the playing field and encourage more of our young folks to teach our youngest kids?
Well, we as a society could certainly make a decision, and I would favor it, to allocate a portion of our state budget and our state resources to early childhood. But I'd want to do that in a fashion that would really get quality and efficiency and effectiveness. And so I would, again, I think a great thing would be to give parents, new parents, a voucher to find a quality childhood center for them to work with. And they would do it based upon their own needs. They would do it based, if they had English as a second language, maybe it would be a school that would have bilingual instruction, and they could use that voucher there, or they could use it some other place where maybe they thought their child had an aptitude for, some other, some quality or some future skill, and they would choose a childhood center based on that. Boy, wouldn't that be wonderful to have even listen, a couple years old, you don't know what you're going to do, right? But certainly kids, have aptitudes, and their parents have certain proclivities as well, and maybe they'd want to have their children go to certain, specialized schools. Again, the last thing we want to do is turn it over to the politicians. We got to get the politicians out of the business. It ought to be education professionals. It ought to be parents working with them to choose a good school and have it be competitive. That is paramount in my view.
To that point, Mr. Cox, the field of early childhood doesn't have a well-known or high-powered lobby or special interest group, and from what we know, that's the most important time of our lives, is that the first few years of life. Yet there is no formalized lobby.
No parents' union.
Right, there's no parents' union, exactly right.
Not yet.
What would you do as governor to ensure that there is a level playing field between other interests that the state and other priorities that the state has to focus on, and this group that doesn't have a real voice in Sacramento?
Well, first of all, first and foremost, and I said it at the outset, I'm not playing at the margins here. I'm going right at the transformation of the system. We've got to get the special interests out. We've got to get the special interests out of power. We've got to get them to a point where the people are back in power. Last week, our team filed 800,000 signatures for a ballot initiative called the Neighborhood Legislature. And, this is new, it's different. Well, I got to tell you, doing the same things expecting a different result, Einstein, right?
We know what that is.
Insanity, right? So we got to change the system. This is a far-reaching reform, but it really makes a lot of sense because it makes all the districts so tiny that the money doesn't matter. You go door to door to get elected. And I think we need to do that. We need to get the special interests out of power. They're the ones that are blocking any kind of reform. They're the reason you can't do anything about pensions. They're the reason you can't do anything about the seniority system. They're the reason you can't really, do vouchers, because they want power and they're going to spend their money to do it, positively and negatively. We have to recognize that we've turned our system over to the fundraisers, and that's the problem. So I'm going to hopefully, through my efforts and as a businessman running for governor, lead us, I guess, to think about a different kind of system that's puts us back in control.
And you know, we shared with your team a recent poll that the Community Foundation and the Choose Children Initiative had conducted statewide that asked voters, you know, what are your priorities in terms of spending that the next governor should focus on?
Yeah.
And certainly the, you know, environment, affordable housing, transportation, those all came up. At the same time, more investment in young children was on par, if not greater, in terms of importance. Do you think this neighborhood legislature's idea would also bring up some of these issues that families are facing every day?
You know, most of us are parents. Most of us are leaders of our families. I mean, that's, you know, we want to have a say-so in what goes on in our state. And I think we all look at the system and we say, we really don't have much of a say. I mean, you know, most people never get to meet their legislator. Most people don't have the power of the lobbyists. And, you know, I think people are going to be looking for doing that. And education is probably the most paramount thing to a family. Think about it. I mean, how many other things are as important as to make sure my mother beat into my head the fact that no one could ever take away what was in my brain. She beat it into my head, and that's why I got a good education. I became a lawyer because she said that, you know, that would be the thing that I would always be able to own is my knowledge. And we've got to do that to compete in the world. I've got to tell you, other countries aren't standing still. China, Korea, the countries of Europe, they're emphasizing early childhood education. They're emphasizing education at all levels. And several have gone to school choice, by the way. You know that around the world. We've got to really address the fact that we're in a competitive world and we've got to stay ahead. And that requires us to do the very best for our children.
So, Mr. Cox, I just have one more question for you, pretty specific, and then we're going to turn it over to our guests here for a few minutes for a couple of questions. But my last question, again, wanted to jump on what you just said about what other countries are doing to support families with young kids and their education system as well. The U.S. is the only country in the developed world without a paid family leave policy. California has one, but not many families can afford to utilize it. Is that something that you would support to expand as governor?
Well, I think it's certainly a wonderful thing to do. In my company, we're successful. I do some of that. I mean, I don't necessarily do 6 months or something like that, but I do a couple of months. The trouble in California is that we've gone kind of overboard in a lot of these things. You now can't ask a prospective employee what they were making at their prior job. You can't ask them about a criminal record and other things like this. We've put so many regulations and so many restrictions on business. I believe businesses should do what they need to do to attract employees. But I got to tell you, we live in a competitive country. We're seeing it. States compete against each other. We're losing businesses every single day. I just mentioned Intel, but it's thousands of businesses leaving this state. And if you don't believe it's going to happen to California, go look into the future. Look at my home state of Illinois. Businesses are fleeing Illinois right now because it's going bankrupt. This state has $1 trillion unfunded pension liability. That's a sword of Damocles hanging over our head. Businesses know that's going to hit at some point in time. The more regulations, the more restrictions we put on business, the more they're going to just leave and go to other states. Now, it shouldn't be a race to the bottom. Hopefully, we have enough attractions here to make sure that people stay here, but it's always a balancing act. And we got to make sure that we have an economy that keeps growing so that we have a bigger pie, so that we can provide paid family leave and other benefits. There's a lot of other benefits that we want to have as well.
Great. Well, thank you. if you would like to learn more about John Cox and his candidacy, you can visit johncoxforgovernor.com.
And John, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
thank you.
It's a great pleasure. We were talking earlier, we're both Chicago kids.
Yes.
And in fact, his mom taught at one of my public high school for a while in the summer. So fortunately, I didn't have to go to summer school, so I didn't have the privilege. But I appreciate your perspective on vouchers, on local control, on the need for our community to become more competitive on early learning with foreign countries, and early learning is a real commitment. So I thank you for your commitment there. The Community Foundation, as Avo was saying, is committed to early learning. We believe that investment early will prevent paying triple later down the road for jails and other activities. Will be more productive. People will be able to pay taxes. They will have a greater self-esteem and participation in the economy if we make those investments early. One of the things that I think is important, and I'll only take a minute to do this, as a community foundation, we are a 501c3, and we can be nonprofit and nonpartisan and have points of view about the direction of our community. We can be both of those things. So our gubernatorial forums around this issue, we believe, is consistent with those principles. And we hope to do more of these things to create dialogue and conversation as we look to people who will lead us in our state around important issues that we believe as a community foundation are critical to our growth. So we appreciate those guests that are coming to us, are sharing their views, creating a forum, because we are committed that the next governor of California, whoever that will be, will have a commitment to early learning issues and early childhood development. So again, I thank you all so much for coming. And John, I want to thank you again, because I know you had to make this work across a number of different commitments.
I want to be everywhere. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. Please thank John.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.